Hop in as we travel to Shaker Village of Pleasant Hill.
In this podcast, we'll be talking to Becky Soules, the Education and Collections Director at Shaker Village of Pleasant Hill. She's going to be telling us about October things, specifically about their Spirit Strolls, which are stories of death, destruction, and mayhem involving the Shaker community there. It's a great time. We hope you'll join us.
Let's go.
So I'm Becky Soules, BeckysOules, and I'm Shaker Village's Collections and Education Director.
That sounds like a big job that involves a lot. I cannot imagine the vast collections of information that you all have. So let's start off with, can you just share a little bit with us about Shaker Village?
Of course. So Shaker Village has been a museum and historic site and nonprofit since 1961, and we share the legacy of the Kentucky Shakers in a variety of ways through our 3,000 acres of property, through our 34 historic buildings, and through all of the tours and other amenities that we have to offer. So everything from coming to take a Spirit Stroll on an October evening to coming to dine in our restaurant or stay overnight in our inn.
Yeah, and a lot of people, like the people who listen to our podcast, we believe will want to know stories and things that everyone may not know.
Sure.
So can you tell us a little bit about the Shaker history of the community here and maybe just, the entire Shaker community at large?
Sure, of course. One of the coolest parts of my job is the fact that I both preserve the things in our collection that relate to the Shaker, so over 3,000 objects and other stories that we have about the Shakers, but then also get to figure out how we transmute that to the public and how we share it. So that's probably the best part about telling these stories. So the Shakers are a Protestant Christian religious denomination that came over from England in 1774 as a very small group. Nine Shakers immigrated from England. And then in America, they really developed into a very important and perhaps one of the most important utopian communal societies of 19th century America. At their height, there was over 6,000 Shakers living in 18 communal settlements.
Wow.
They begin in New York and New England. And then by 1805, the early Shakers back east send missionaries west to what is then the far west of Kentucky, Ohio, and Indiana. And that's when Pleasant Hill is established in 1805, 1806. So we're sort of that second generation of Shaker communities that are founded. And from 1805 until 1923, there was over about 2,500 to 3,000 Shakers who lived and worked here and called Pleasant Hill home.
That's significant.
Yeah, so it was the missionary movement that kind of spread the belief system to the state of Kentucky from New England state.
Yeah, so it's a very specific missionary movement started by the Shakers, this idea that they had 11 successful communities back east, but they were ready to expand. They had heard about all the revivals, the most famous of which would be like the Cane Ridge Revival. It happens in 1801. And the Shakers hear about that back east and decide that it looks like there's people who might be interested in hearing their unique religious message in Kentucky. Because there's a few things that make the Shakers different than their Protestant neighbors. They're believers in equality. They believe in a sort of a dual aspect God that has both male and female properties. And from out of that comes a belief in the idea that men and women are equal. So in Shaker Villages, if you visit Pleasant Hill today, you might notice the unique architecture and the symmetry of our buildings with doorways and staircases for men and women. So in a Shaker community, men are supervised by men and sort of have their spaces, and same for the women. Shakers were also celibate, which might be one of the few things that people often know about them, which definitely causes them to have some unique issues when it comes to recruiting new converts. But they believed that by having new converts only through conversion, it would really inspire people to be committed to the faith.
It's so interesting. And that is distinctly different than what most people think of when they think of Protestants. The duality, which also
Definitely
led to the symmetry in their architecture we've read, and some really fascinating things about them. So in the fall, you all tell some unique stories about the Shaker history.
Yes.
And your Spirit Strolls.
Yes.
So can you share a little bit about those?
Yes, we often describe the Shakers as falling in that category of utopians. They're trying to create a utopian society. They're trying to create heaven on earth. They believe that they're living in the new millennium. So one of the really interesting things that we do as we're sort of in spooky season at Halloween time is to think about how those ideals maybe fell short in reality and how ultimately they're trying to create heaven on earth, but they are really just people living and working here at Pleasant Hill. And there's a lot of, with for lack of a better word, death, destruction, and mayhem that happen in a community of living, breathing human beings.
Sure.
So Spirit Strolls is a revamp this year with all new stories, but it's a tour that lets us talk about things like death and tragedy and sickness and feuds within members, like different members of the community, and all those sort of aspects of make the Shakers human, make them more than just sort of a caricature of religious believers in the past.
Interesting.
So, in other words, things that might not necessarily lend themselves to a utopian society.
Exactly. And the stories that we don't always get to tell, because we are, here, our job is to tell the legacy of the Kentucky Shakers in all of its facets, but it's a lot easier to talk about maybe how they believed in pacifism rather than talk about the Shaker brother who gets in what they describe as a fracas with another young man and accidentally almost slits his throat open.
Wow.
So, people have fights and have conflict, but that's a much more individual and personal story than this idea of, the Shakers as pacifists.
Sure. So you said this year's Spirit Strolls are all new stories, things people have never heard before. We won't ask you to spoil any of those stories for people who may be coming, but could you maybe share an example from a year prior? Of a story.
We can spoil it a little bit.
Oh, okay.
So
we're all for that too.
In years prior, one of our themes was really looking at the Shakers' religious beliefs during a certain era. They had an era in the 1830s and 1840s that they called the era of manifestations or the era of mother's work. And it's a time when their beliefs sort of manifest in these spiritual gifts. So the Shakers had worship at these outdoor sites. Their worship services might go on for 6, 10, 12 hours at a time. They believe they're receiving all these divinely inspired spiritual gifts like new music and drawings and things that they're being told to do. So we talked a lot about that aspect of the community in the past, which sort of ties into their belief in spiritualism and those aspects of Spirit Strolls. But this year we went sort of a little bit deeper and darker. One of my staff members joked that we were, our foray into true crime.
Oh, wow.
So in some cases we have these stories that we maybe don't know much about, but if we do a little digging, we can find things. So we have a journal entry that it says sort of an underlined word. The heading of the journal entry is murderer.
Wow.
Which is something that we've had this journal for years. We'd seen it. We sort of just flip on past it. And a very short one-sentence description about how a man, so I think John Gunsolly, alias John Riffle, was arrested here at Shaker Village from the North Lot today, which sparked that discussion. Who is this person? Could we find out more? And with all the great resources of newspaper databases, with the Kentucky Department of Library and Archives, with state penitentiary records, with court case records, we could really dive in and figure out that this was a man who basically committed a crime of passion in Lexington and then came and hid out with the Shakers for several months.
Yeah. A closed community would be a great hiding spot.
Great hiding spot.
And it's fascinating that you all are able now to retrieve all this information. Yeah. You all kind of done your own little true crime podcast, if you will, except, Spirit Stroll version. I love that.
And
that's
so
pretty cool.
Lots of gaps in the story that we'll never be able to answer. But I think that's one of those places that in Spirit Strolls we're okay with a little bit of ambiguity and telling what we know. And then, if visitors want to draw their own conclusions, they can do that.
Exactly. You're just telling exactly what you said, what you know, and then I love that. That's pretty cool. It's amazing that you've been able to find out that much.
The visitors can embellish the story a little.
Or there's things we sort of, we might be very careful with talking about, we might think this, but, and sort of all the pieces logically would make sense in that way, but we don't have documentary evidence to tell that specific, outcome of a narrative.
We understand. That's really cool. So what other things do you all have going on in the fall? Our podcasts lately have been like October things that people will want to know. So I think you all have things other than just the Spirit Strolls.
Sure,
correct?
we do. We're certainly open for daily visitors. And then we have our very family-friendly trick-or-treat event coming up on October 18th and 19th. So a great opportunity for the kids who Spirit Strolls wouldn't be appropriate for, to bring them
Right.
out to go trick-or-treating at Shaker Village and go on a hayride, explore the village in a very family-friendly evening way.
Love that. And just on a regular day, what would be a lovely series of things to take in if you were visiting in the fall or the early holiday season?
Of course. So on a daily basis, on Tuesdays through Sundays, all of our exhibits are open, and we have about 6 or 7 tours daily. So on different topical things, we've been talking about children going back to school, talking about our fall orchard harvest, different tours that would be very seasonal. And then, of course, folks can enjoy one of their meals at our restaurant, or if they want to make a weekend of it or an overnight, come out and spend the night at our inn as well.
Yeah, and you all have some lovely rooms.
We really
to
do.
stay here. How many? There's 13
13 buildings with
I
72
believe.
rooms.
That's really significant. And your trustees table is open 7 days a week.
Mhm. Correct.
Breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You can have a glass of wine with your meal, and isn't the Shakers do drink alcohol? Is that correct?
Yes. So particularly in Kentucky, I think, the Pleasant Hill Shakers are not always the paragons of virtue maybe compared to the rest of the Shaker world, but in Kentucky, I think no Shaker was going to convert if they couldn't keep their alcohol. So
That makes sense.
we know
Yeah.
that they were buying whiskey in the early years of the community. We know they had a small vineyard at one point. They would have drunk lots of hard cider that they would have used their own apples to make. And so it's something that we serve here, in a story that we want to talk about, that the Shakers didn't see any real reason that they couldn't enjoy alcohol in moderation.
Part of that making them more relatable as humans.
Yes, definitely.
Because we do think of them, I think, as so utopic and so balanced. I think when you learn a little bit about them, especially with the symmetry, you think of a very ordered life. So I love that, this season is kind of bringing out some things that make them a little more relatable. Okay, so did you have a question?
Yeah, I was going to say, can you talk just a little bit more about the trustees table and the food and the preparation of the food and where it comes from? And
Sure. So we're a seats table restaurant. So a lot of the food is coming out of our garden. Certainly at this time of year, as our garden's transitioning more into a wintertime thing, maybe less fresh fruits and vegetables, but still using what we're able, using things that have been canned and preserved and stored for winter months as well. And then while we don't necessarily serve traditional Shaker food, we're definitely in that spirit of the Shakers as we try to do everything. So we have some Shaker recipes, like our Shaker lemon pie recipe, which is an authentic Shaker
It's
recipe.
delicious, yes.
And then a lot of recipes that were introduced by our current chef, but then also some homages to our history as a historic site institution. So recipes that have been on the menu since we opened in the 1960s.
yeah,
Wow.
and so if someone comes and eats at the trustees table and they get their bellies full, then they can go out, and I think there's a lot of trails, a lot of miles of trails. How
yeah.
many?
That's a great combination,
Yeah.
Feed the stomach and then go out and feed the mind and the soul and enjoy our over 30 miles of hiking
30
trails.
miles, yeah.
And you can, even if you have, if you enjoy horseback riding, bring your own horse, but we have horseback riding, or you can make arrangements and come enjoy some of the trails with that as well.
I think that one thing is we've learned more about Shaker Village of Pleasant Hill. We think of the buildings, we think of, the exhibits, which are lovely and wonderful. But you all have how many acres here? It really is a big campus.
Yeah, we have about 3,000 acres. The Shakers, when they were living here in the 19th century, at their peak would have had somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 acres of property to
Wow.
really support that community that numbered almost 500 members at one point. And I don't think we always think about the fact that the Shakers, have this portion that we see today as the historic center at the heart of the village, but also all the outlying fields and pastures and woodlots and the property down at the river and their mill structures. So they were really creating, like that idea of creating heaven on earth. They were creating a very separate community that was connected to Lexington and Harrodsburg and Danville and other regional areas, but it's really its own independent community.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems like they were doing it. You know, they were sustaining themselves pretty much. I'm sure they traded with others somewhat,
Definitely.
but pretty much managed everything that they needed
Yeah,
for their own community.
Shakers want to make everything they can, but they're also pragmatists. So there's some things that it's more practical to purchase. Shakers of Pleasant Hill are the only community that has direct river access right from their property. So that gave them a really unique advantage. So in the 19th century, the Kentucky River was navigable for about 6 months of the year. So they could use the Kentucky River to go, put goods on a steamboat or a flatboat, go down to the Ohio River, and then down that to the Mississippi. So major hub of goods, and a place that they recruited members from was actually Louisiana. So it's kind of incredible to think of how far Pleasant Hill's networks extended. And we know that they were selling their goods in Oklahoma, in Texas, in Louisiana, in lots of different places.
And some of the goods that they sold, or the more prominent goods, were seeds.
Yeah, exactly. So if you've ever planted a garden in your backyard and bought those little paper or plastic packets of seeds, you can thank the Shakers.
Wow.
That idea of selling seeds that were pretty much guaranteed to germinate and weren't just out of some person's barn and they were who knows how old. And also with direction. So understanding that not everyone has that innate knowledge of farming. So Shaker seeds have, what variety is it? How do you plant it? When do you harvest it? All of those details.
Did they even include like the planting zones back then, or was that a little too early?
Too early for planting zones, but they might tell you, what time of year you're going to plant it, or plant it in full sun. So enough directions that people could know what they were doing.
So they were pretty daggone entrepreneurial.
Yeah,
really.
Definitely.
I mean, they were advanced in many ways, and that's really important to think about. I think how they can be kind of a roadmap for us, of how
Definitely.
they just made it work.
Yeah.
They put it systems in place and things like that. So, and also this entire village is on the National Historic Register. Is that correct?
Yeah, so we're a National Historic Landmark, which means we're a site of national importance that's listed on a register through the federal government. And we're also the largest collection of privately owned buildings that date to the 19th century.
Wow, that's impressive. It's amazing that you all have been able to preserve the history here like you have. And you all are a nonprofit, is that correct?
That's correct.
And so how can people get more information about the village if they want to come, if they want to visit, if they want to donate, however they want to engage?
Well, we definitely need those people to come out and engage with us, because we're only here because of everyone's support. It's really it takes a village to create a village, and we wouldn't still be here after more than 60 years as a museum without all that support. So our website is a great way to check us out. And visit shakervillageky.org. Calling our phone number is also a great way of getting more information. But and coming out and visiting us and just sort of letting your day unfold and exploring the site is also great.
We've gotten to come several times, and I really think to be here is to experience it in a way that reading about it or watching a video or podcast about it can never really help you understand what they did here. You all have done a lovely job, I think. One thing before we go, you all also, if we look past spooky season a little bit, you all also have some holiday things that'll be coming up as well.
We do have a lot of holiday things coming up, sort of ramping up with Thanksgiving and with Thanksgiving meals at the trustees table.
Okay.
And then also an event, Blessing of the Hounds, right after Thanksgiving, and then all the way into
I love that.
Christmas with our illuminated evenings programs. We also do candlelight tours at Christmas. So if you aren't into spooky things but want to come join us for an after hours tour, we have that. And
kind of another option.
Yep.
Are they called illuminated?
Yep, we have an event called Illuminated Evenings on the first 3 Saturdays in December. And that's another, again, a really family-friendly event with Santa Claus will be out here to talk to the kids. Mrs. Claus often puts in an appearance.
Wow.
Kids' crafts. We invite local music groups out to do singing and do some small performances and the village all decorated.
Yeah. It sounds like a lovely time.
Yeah.
And Shaker Village, if you're in Kentucky, Shaker Village of Pleasant Hill is really accessible and easily drivable for a road trip for most. And you all are open again Tuesdays through...
We're open Tuesdays through Sundays for our exhibit spaces, but we are open 7 days a week to come out and enjoy the property, to dine, and to stay the night.
Wow. Thank you so much. It's been lovely talking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you for all your knowledge. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.